I was 8 years old the first time I noticed that my mother spoke differently to white people. Her voice softer, her words carefully measured, like she was treading water that was always just a little too deep for her. I didn't understand it then, but I saw it in the way she held her breath in department stores, in the way she smiled just a little too much at cashiers, in the way she corrected me whenever I spoke too freely in public. "Be polite," she would say. "Be careful. Don't give them a reason." I never knew who "them" was, but I learned the rules anyway. Don't run in stores. Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Don't look suspicious, even when you're doing nothing wrong. It wasn't until I was 13 that I learned that no matter how many rules you follow, they will still find a way to see you as a problem. It was summer break, my first job caddying at a golf course in a part of town that people like us didn't live in. I woke up early, put on my polo shirt that was a size too big, walked 3 miles to get there because my mother didn't want me taking the bus alone. It paid $20 a day plus tips, more money than I had ever seen at once. I had been working there for 3 weeks when it happened. The golfer was an older white man, one of the regulars. He never learned my name, just called me Kid Boy once when he was annoyed that I hadn't handed him the right club. I gritted my teeth, swallowed it down like I had been taught. But that day he had been in a bad mood, missing his shots, blaming the course, blaming me. It started small. A muttered insult under his breath, a roll of the eyes, but then the putt he had been lining up missed the hole completely. "That's your fault," he snapped. I blinked, confused. "Sir, I didn't." "Don't talk back to me, boy." Something in me tightened, but I kept my mouth shut, kept my head down, just like my mother told me to. But then he stepped closer, lowered his voice so only I could hear. "You people always have an excuse." My face burned. I wanted to say something, to push back, to tell him he had no right, but I could already feel the weight of his words pressing down on me like a hand on my throat. When the round was over, he tossed a crumpled $5 bill at my feet and walked away laughing with his friends. I left early that day, didn't even wait for my shift to end, walked all the way home, my hands shaking. My mother took one look at me and knew. She didn't ask what happened, just pulled me into a hug and whispered, "You did the right thing." But it didn't feel like the right thing, it felt like swallowing glass. I quit the next morning, told my mother I didn't want to go back. She just nodded and said she understood. Years later, when I was in college, I got an internship at a law firm downtown. First in my family to go to college first, to wear a suit to work first, to have an office, even if it was just a shared one with another intern. On my 3rd day, one of the senior partners walked by, glanced at me, then stopped, turned to the receptionist and asked, "When did we start hiring for security?" I laughed at first, thought he was joking, until I saw the way the receptionist's face went pale, how she stammered through an explanation that I was the new legal intern, how the partner nodded, slow, and said nothing else before walking away. I sat at my desk staring at my hands, my fingers curling and uncurling into fists. I wanted to be angry, but I was too tired. I wanted to explain, but I was too used to it. So I did what my mother taught me. I swallowed it down and kept working, but the weight of it never left. It was years later, when I was a lawyer myself, walking into courtrooms where I was always assumed to be the defendant instead of the defense attorney, that I realized that it didn't matter how many degrees I had, how many suits I owned, how careful I was with my words. They still saw me the way they wanted to. It didn't matter how hard I worked, they still saw a problem. I was 29 when I stopped caring about making them comfortable. I stopped softening my voice, stopped smiling when I didn't want to, stopped making myself smaller just to fit in spaces that were never meant for me. The first time I stood in a courtroom and introduced myself as lead counsel, I saw the way the judge raised his eyebrows, saw the way the prosecutor looked at me like I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. But I also saw my client, a young black man, falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and I knew that my presence in that room mattered whether they wanted it to or not. That night I went home, poured myself a drink, and thought about my mother. I thought about the way she had held her breath around white people, how she had carried herself with caution in every space she entered. And I realized that I was done holding my breath. I had spent my whole life trying to prove to the world that I was not a problem. But the truth was I never was. They just never wanted to see me as anything else. I thought that once I became a lawyer, once I had the title, once I had the credentials, that people would stop seeing me as a problem. That my name, my skin, my presence in a room would no longer make people pause. But some things don't change, no matter how many degrees you hang on the wall. It started with a case one that should have been simple. A 21-year-old black college student arrested for trespassing in his own apartment complex. He had forgotten his key, tried to climb through his window. A neighbor called the police. They arrived, guns drawn, threw him to the ground before he could explain, didn't ask for ID until after they had cuffed him. The charges should have been dropped immediately, but they weren't. They never are when you look like us. When I walked into the courtroom for his arraignment, the judge barely glanced at me, kept calling me counselor, like he was avoiding my name, like saying it would take too much effort. The prosecutor, a young white man fresh out of law school, smirked when he saw me. I could already hear the argument forming in his head, the excuses, the justifications. Match the description. They were responding to a call. They were just doing their job. I had heard them all before. When the judge set bail higher than necessary, I clenched my jaw. My client's mother was in the back row, hands clasped in silent prayer. I knew she didn't have the money, knew this meant her son would spend at least a few weeks in jail waiting for a system designed to break him. I filed the paperwork to appeal the bail, got an emergency hearing the next day, walked into that courtroom prepared to fight. But before I could even sit down, an officer at the door stopped me. "Attorneys only," he said. I blinked. "I am an attorney." He frowned, looked me up and down, took in my tailored suit, my polished shoes, but all he saw was my skin. "Let me see your bar card." I had been a lawyer for 6 years, and no one had ever asked me for that before. I handed it to him without a word, watched as he examined it like it was fake, like I wasn't supposed to have it. When he finally let me through, I sat at the table next to my client, took a slow breath, and reminded myself that I had earned my place here, that no one could take that from me. The judge lowered the bail, but not by much, still too high for his mother to pay, still too much for a young man who had done nothing wrong. I spent the next 2 days calling bail funds nonprofits, anyone who could help. I didn't sleep much, barely ate, but I got him out. The case dragged on for weeks, hearings, motions, delays, but in the end the charges were dismissed, not because the system worked, but because we fought, because we refused to accept injustice as inevitable. When it was over, my client's mother hugged me, tears in her eyes, whispered, "Thank you," like I had done something special, like I had given her something the world had told her she couldn't have. But I hadn't done anything special, I had just done my job. That night I went home, poured myself a drink, and thought about my mother. about the way she had taught me to make myself small, to be polite, to be careful about how I had spent my whole life trying to prove that I was worthy of respect, that I belonged in the rooms I walked into. And I wondered how many more times I would have to prove it before the world finally believed me, before the world finally stopped seeing me as a problem that needed to be solved. I thought that after winning case after case, after proving myself in every courtroom, that the weight of my skin would lessen, that the world would finally see me as I was. But the thing about being black in America is that no matter how far you go, no matter how much you achieve, you will always be one moment away from being reminded of where they think you belong. It started on a Saturday morning. The kind of morning I rarely got to enjoy, where I didn't have to wake up early for a hearing or rush to meet a client. I had just picked up coffee from a small shop near my apartment, still in sweatpants, an old college hoodie. Nothing about me said lawyer, but everything about me still said threat. I was walking back to my car when I heard the voice, sharp, authoritative. "Hey, you stop." I turned slowly, hands visible, just like I had been taught since childhood. 2 police officers were walking toward me. One had his hand near his holster. I felt my body tense, but I stayed calm. "Is there a problem, officers?" One of them narrowed his eyes. "We got a call about someone suspicious in the area." I glanced around at the street lined with joggers, dog walkers, people sipping overpriced lattes on cafe patios. None of them looked like me. "I just got coffee," I said, lifting the cup slightly as if that proved something. "Do you live around here?" I exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to say that my tax dollars paid their salaries, that I had more education than both of them combined, that I had spent my entire life following rules that never protected me. Instead, I said, "Yes, I do." They exchanged a look like they didn't believe me, like I needed to explain myself further, but I didn't say anything else. I just waited. Finally, one of them nodded. "All right, move along." Move along like I was an inconvenience, like I was a mistake that they hadn't quite figured out how to fix. I walked to my car, got in but didn't drive. I just sat there, fingers gripping the steering wheel, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I wanted to scream, wanted to slam my fist against the dashboard, wanted to do anything that would make this feeling go away. But I already knew that nothing would. That night I sat at my desk staring at an open document on my laptop. I had written about injustice, about the law, about cases that exposed the cracks in the system, but I had never written about myself, about what it felt like to be a lawyer who still had to prove that he wasn't a criminal just for existing. So I wrote. I wrote about the way the officer's hand hovered near his gun, about the way I had to measure every word, every movement to keep from becoming the next headline. I wrote about how exhausting it was to carry that weight every single day, about how even with my suit, my title, my degrees, I was still seen the same way. I had been seen as a child in department stores with my mother as a teenager, working my first job as a law student, walking into courtrooms where people assumed I was the defendant instead of the defense. I sent the article to my editor and went to bed without checking my inbox. By the next morning, it had gone viral. My phone buzzed nonstop. Emails, interview requests, messages from people saying they had lived the same thing, and from others saying I was making it up, that I was playing victim, that racism wasn't real, if I had managed to become successful. I ignored the noise and kept working. A week later, I was walking into court for a case when a young black law student stopped me outside, his eyes wide with something that looked like admiration. He hesitated, then said, "I read your article. I just wanted to say thank you." I nodded, but before I could respond, he added, "It helps knowing I'm not crazy, that it's not just me." That night I thought about my father, about my mother, about every conversation we had where they told me to be careful, where they warned me that the world would never see me the way I saw myself. And I realized they had been right. But I also realized something else. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone.